Now you're with military families. Do you have someone who's been in the war?
My son, his picture is right here on this poster, has been deployed twice. He's been in Kuwait and he's been in Afghanistan.
I've often heard people talk about Syria without knowing anything about Syria, but they have a prepackaged notion of imperialism, and they know that Syria is on the right side and the US is on the wrong side, and therefore we have to side with the Syrian regime against the people.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 23 cable stations from northern Vermont to southern Manhattan. Our website, thestruggle.org, and our YouTube channel with 1,000 videos, Struggle Video Media. 24 years of bombing, sanctions, shock and awe in Iraq. What has been the result? 4,500 Americans dead, 1.5 million Iraqis dead, and $3 trillion spent or owed to the wounded. And the result, the neocon, neoliberal regime in Baghdad is falling apart. That Iraqi army, so well trained and well supplied by the US, threw down its weapons in Mosul and in northern Iraq. Diplomats are fleeing the green zone as fast as they can. The Iraqi government has closed off the internet because they're afraid the population will be demoralized by the videos that the jihadis post up on the internet. Obama says, though, all options are on the table and has sent several hundred soldiers back into Iraq. In New York City, a small group of people tried to show anti-war signs outside of a fundraiser that was attended by Barack Obama. The police harassed them and made them walk or face arrest. We'll show you video. Then a talk about Syria at the Left Forum. Not the usual bemoaning of savagery on all sides, but a man who's visited Syria many times, who talks about how hundreds of thousands of people are in liberated areas trying to live free without any tyranny by either Assad or the jihadis. We began on Broadway in Manhattan.
Right. Well, they first got to keep the presence over there.
Hi, how are you? Yeah, everybody's asking questions about Megan. Everybody's asking questions about
Iraq bother you?
Hi.
Hey. How did the camera people on the road?
This is day 3 or 4 of Obama's assessments that his administration is pursuing all options against Iraq. And we know this means bombs, possible drones, according to John Kerry, aerial strikes with Tomahawk missiles, or maybe just B-52s with regular conventional bombs. There are aircraft carriers gathering in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. has been after Iraq for 23 years. It's responsible for the deaths of well over 1 million Iraqis so far, with its invasion in 1991 and its invasion and occupation in 2003. It destroyed the country of Iraq. Every civil system, education, legal, medicine, water, sewage, security, destroyed. And worst of all, they created a situation where the Islamic fundamentalists are running rampant. This was never the situation in Iraq before. But this is a creation of the U.S. occupation. Now Obama's threats to bomb Iraq will accomplish what they've always done, terrorizing the civilian population. This is completely unacceptable. We're demanding here today, when Obama is speaking across the street at a Democratic Party fundraiser, no bombs on Iraq, no secret ops, no material, nothing else to foster the war going on inside and from outside Iraq, or Syria for that matter.
24 years of this war. Enough!
I'm a member of Military Families Speak Out, and I'm here to tell Obama that we are sick of these endless wars, that we destroyed the infrastructure of Iraq the first time we invaded in the Gulf War. We completely destroyed the social fabric of the country in the second war and caused needless deaths of our own troops and of people who live in Iraq. And there's nothing that justifies invading that country again. I'm here to speak out against military intervention in Iraq and to say that we need to bring our troops home and our war dollars home and spend them in this country where we need the money to be spent. No more blood for oil.
Now you're with Military Families. Do you have someone who's been in the war?
My son, his picture is right here on this poster, has been deployed twice. He's been in Kuwait and he's been in Afghanistan. And I'm here to support the Military Families Speak Out strategy of zero troops abroad. That includes the Middle East and that includes Africa.
Well, I understand Military Families has been a bit quiet and is reviving.
It's reviving now. There's a new national coordinator in California, and we're reviving the chapter in New York City. I'm now going to be the head of the chapter in Brooklyn. We have an email at the bottom of this poster, www.mfso.org. Any military family member who wants to stand up in the fight against these endless U.S. interventions in other countries can contact us through this website.
And I'm here to protest against another U.S. imperialist intervention on the sovereign state of Iraq. And this is going to be after 20 continuous years of harassment. So I'm here to protest and try to stop that, because it is possible to stop it. The people can't stop it. The threat against Syria, which took place in August, is a good example of people coming up and pressuring the government and stopping another imperialist incursion.
The media commentators debate what to do. Well, rather than trying to put out the fire by pouring gasoline on it, two suggestions. One, spend billions to aid hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who are now in refugee camps. And two, to help combat the ISIL, break relations with the worst jihadi dictators on the planet, the Saudi king and princes, to whom we are happily selling $60 billion worth of armaments. Yaseer Munif of the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution is a professor at Emerson College.
The real disconnect between what's happening on the ground, what I've seen with people and grassroots movement in the liberated areas and the occupied areas, and that's, by the way, the language that people used, because oftentimes I'm asked why liberated and so on. And what we see in the media in the West and even the Arab media. On the one hand, we have tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people talking about the revolution, talking about alternative society, talking about creating a new culture, experimenting with all these different institution knowledges. It's a big laboratory. And then what you see in the media is basically ISIS, the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and Al-Nusra and the jihadists, and the flow of jihadists into Syria, and the militarization of the conflict, and so on. And so what I would like to do is basically try to shed light on what I've seen in Manbij, a medium-sized liberated city in northern Syria, about half an hour from the Turkish borders, to show how much has been done, and under extremely challenging conditions. We have to remember that even when you are in a liberated city, even when you are in this in the liberated north or the south, there is constant airstrikes, and people are basically building this alternative society and those alternative and new knowledges. And I think this is extremely important. Oftentimes we focus on the military and where we get weapons and so on, and in the meantime, people are creating a new culture. They are getting bombed, and there are casualties almost on a weekly basis, at least in Manbij. And remember, Manbij is not necessarily a strategic city, and so the regime is not really interested in destroying the city, but it has to remind people living there that they are the major force, the major power in Syria, and they're gonna come and reconquer Manbij at some point. And so, in trying to look at that, what I'm calling the unthinkable revolution, the invisible revolution, the revolution that we can't speak of, that we can't grasp, that language cannot recognize, because we don't have the appropriate tools, the appropriate conceptual tools to basically talk about what people are doing, because they're not using prepackaged language about imperialism. I've often heard people talk about Syria without knowing anything about Syria, but they have a prepackaged notion of imperialism, and they know that Syria is on the right side and the US is on the wrong side, and therefore we have to side with the Syrian regime against the people. And that's the irony of the situation we're dealing with. At the same time, we have a lot of talk about proxy wars, about sectarian conflict, and we heard that in the previous panel. We have a lot of analysis about the new Cold War between Russia and the US. We had the jihadist holy war between the jihadists and the unbelievers, this dichotomy or binary world, and so on. But we don't hear much about the revolution. What is that? And what I'm arguing is that there is a new language, what I'm calling decolonial language, because there is a process of decolonization in Syria, even if some people don't like that. And I liked what Talal was saying, and also Muhammad, about the parallels between what's happening in Palestine and what's happening in Syria. And I think this is actually true for the entire Arab world. There is a process of decolonization. What we have in the Arab world is a continuation of colonization by new means. It's a neo-colonial process. And Frantz Fanon has described that beautifully, I think, in his books. And therefore, there is a process of decolonization right now, because the decolonization process has been abrupt, and it was stopped by the Arab regime taking power in the 60s and 70s and preventing basically the resolution of the process of decolonization. And so the process of imagining and building this new society could be described as chaotic for observers who basically use secondhand testimonies and rely mostly on the media to describe the process. However, for a person who's on the ground, they will tell you that this is yet, a complex and extremely difficult process, and yet it is a revolution. But we have to look closely and recognize what people are doing. Revolutionaries are experimenting with new conceptual tools, building an alternative society on the ruins of the old one. And that's often a very violent process. I mean, we've seen it in almost every Arab country, in Egypt and in Tunisia, and the Islamists are basically taking advantage of that and trying to reverse the process. And the people we see in Syria, unlike in Egypt, and here we have a comrade from Egypt, and I hope he won't be upset. But I think the Egyptian revolution, at least the first part of the Egyptian revolution, was sexy. And I don't like using that term. But I think in many ways, the Egyptians were, speaking the English language. They had signs in English. They were funny. They had street theater. They had very interesting chants that were appealing to the West and so on, a Western crowd. Things that the Syrians don't necessarily have, and they're mostly speaking Arabic. And the Syrian elite, I think, was very marginal in that regard, in producing that discourse that the West understand. But on the other hand, this puts a new challenge to the left in the West to understand and try to deconstruct that language and really engage with what the Syrians are producing. So the Syrian Revolution don't speak that dominant language, and as a result, they are denied any agency. And that's why we see so many articles about Syrians being manipulated. They are basically the agent of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and fill in the blank. Anyone is playing and manipulating Syrians because they don't speak the language that we like to hear. And obviously, the left has played an important role in undermining that struggle. So briefly to basically describe what I've seen in Syria, I spent almost 3 months in those liberated areas in the north. And Manbij is a quite interesting city. The revolutionaries are mostly nationalist. They are for social justice, although they won't use the language of the left here, but they are for freedom and justice and dignity, and what I describe as the politics of life and the politics of dignity. And I think trying to understand imperialism using dignity as an entry point is much more interesting than using prepackaged and ready-made, formulas for imperialism. So understanding why, so many people are willing to sacrifice their life and defend that dignity, to understand imperialism leads to very interesting analysis. And that's why I'm proposing here this politics of life and this politics of dignity that's been really the central piece and the missing piece for us in the left to understand that process. So I'm going to describe basically 3 important institutions in Manbij, and that is the Revolutionary Council, the Trustee Council, and the Revolutionary Court. And again, I want to emphasize how difficult that process was, because people are being attacked. There are thugs in the city. There are people who actually locate where the meetings are and tell the regime, so that the regime sends airplane and drops explosive barrels and so on. So this is the context we're dealing with. So 3 months before the liberation of Manbij, in April 2012, people, a number of revolutionaries, met and they decided to create the Revolutionary Council. And the city was full of the military and the security, and it's extremely risky to organize in this context. And so they decided to build a network of neighborhood committees so that they take over when the security leaves the city. And they were able to organize or build a network of 50 neighborhood committees. And that's quite spectacular, knowing that the security is everywhere, and they have infiltrated many of the local groups in different cities and so on. But Manbij was able to prevent that. And so when the security left, after almost a year of peaceful protest and massive organizing, and a number of people were killed during that process, the revolutionaries were able to take over the city, and not a single incident was recorded during those 3 days, the transitional period, when the security left the city and the Revolutionary Council took over. But they had major challenges. I mean, they had no funding, zero funding. They received, I think, $8,000 from the Muslim Brotherhood for a city of 400,000 people. So just do the math. In a period of 18 months, they received $8,000. That's the funding we're talking about. Otherwise, it was all funding from people in Manbij and donations from activists and so on. So no funding. They also had no expertise in running the different institutions in the city. There is a gigantic mill that requires a lot of expertise, and therefore there was a major challenge. They had no experience with operating the electricity company, providing water, and the other institutions. And the third challenge they had to deal with is the proliferation of the FSA brigades. Every big family, every tribe, basically created their own FSA, the Free Syrian Army group, to defend their family, to basically be present in the political scene, and that basically hindered the work of the Revolution Council. And like everything else, the revolutionary credit expires with time. People were upset. They weren't able to provide enough food, enough bread. Oftentimes there were power cuts and so on, and the Revolution Council was dealing with that. And I wish the left was actually discussing those questions. How can we help, and how can we propose expertise? And that's part of the thing that I was trying to do, basically create networks of doctors, of engineers, of media activists who would go to those liberated areas and share their expertise and do documentaries and so on. And unfortunately, that was aborted because of ISIS, the Islamic State, taking over the city and basically expelling the revolutionaries. So the revolutionaries decided to create the Trustee Council, and the Trustee Council is basically the legislative power. They invited 600 people they thought were revolutionary to join that council. While the women were unfortunately absent in the council, and that's due to traditional culture in most of Syria, unfortunately, and that's also due to the Syrian regime willingness to basically build on those traditional structures and make alliances with the traditional tribes and basically propagate this politics of patriarchy and so on. So women were completely marginalized, but they were able to create that multi-vocal space where you hear secular and leftist and communist voicing their disagreement with Islamists and nationalists and so on. And this was the first time in 40 or 50 years that you have such a space in Syria, a space where a nationalist could talk to a leftist, and the leftist could criticize a pious person or a traditional person and so on. And I think this is part of what people are basically creating in those different villages and different cities. This space where plurality can coexist. And I think this is going to be with us after the fall of the Syrian regime. This is irreversible. And the third institution I'm going to briefly talk about is the Revolutionary Court. And as you know, with the withering away of the central state and the central power, you have the problem of who's going to do the justice. The revolutionaries were struggling a lot with that. Most of the lawyers are secular, and they were proponent to adopt the Syrian Penal Code. But some of the Islamists wanted al-Sharia to be part of that process. And then you have the customary law. This area is an area where the tribes and the clans are powerful, and they wanted to also have that in the legal system. And so what I saw is a pluri-legal system, something that we're not necessarily familiar with in most of the West, because law is imposed top-down, as opposed to the emergence of legal spaces from the bottom up. And I think this is extremely interesting, despite my resistance and my disagreement with al-Sharia. But I think that this is a process that Syrians need to deal with, and they need to come up with their own legal spaces. The problem with that is when you have multiplicities of courts and people operating a number of different courts in Manbij, is when you're not very happy with the ruling of the secular court. You go to the next door, you knock the, and you want a second trial, and that's a problem. And that's a problem that Syrians are actually dealing with. And that's an extremely difficult question. And actually, the indigenous people are also dealing with some of those questions in Chiapas and in other places. They want, the indigenous culture and knowledge to be recognized. And they don't want, the legal code be imposed from the state, the centralized state. And so those are some of the challenges that Syrians are dealing with. Very briefly, what I want to say is, what I've seen is when Manbij was threatened by ISIS back in January 2014, and the revolutionaries had to fight and liberate their cities, and they did. Most of the jihadist groups, most of the groups that you've heard of were not present, and they were not willing to come and save the city. And so what we've seen in Manbij is the emergence of what I call the city defenders, people who never fought the regime, had to carry weapons and fight for their city and liberate their city and expel ISIS. Unfortunately, ISIS came back, and they currently they have 4,000 fighters in Manbij, an extremely important number, and they use Manbij as a central place to send fighters everywhere in northern Syria. And yet, people were able to organize an extremely successful general strike just a week ago. And as Layla mentioned, it was 90% successful. Only a small minority of ISIS sympathizers refused to close their shops. And ISIS was extremely upset with that. And they threatened to kill people. They threatened to behead people. And the reason why people organized the strike is not because of anti-imperialism or anything like that. They organized the strike because ISIS killed a young man who's 14 or 15 years old, who was suspected to have fought with the FSA, the Free Syrian Army. They killed him, and they crucified him on a tree in Manbij. And that was the reason why. And so we have to recognize and understand, the politics again. I want to end with that. The politics of life and the politics of dignity that is really empowering and basically allowing people to think otherwise and create politics otherwise and decolonize knowledge and those different institutions I talked about. Thank you.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.
When the world has gone crazy and it's all becoming clear, when they're gunning down our comrades and it seems the end is near, as they're loading up the launchers for the tear gas grenades, we can take off our bandanas and kiss behind the barricades. When it's madness all around and you can see this at a glance, we will sing and we will cry, we will laugh and we will dance as they shout their marching orders beneath the helicopter blades. We shall seize the moment for a kiss behind the barricades. They will try to break our spirit, and at times they may succeed, but our love for the world is stronger than their greed. When the building is surrounded and hope begins to fade, in my final hour, a kiss behind the barricades. As the movement grows, there will be hills and bends, but at the center of the struggle are your lovers and your friends. And the more we hold each other up, the less we can be swayed. Here's to love and solidarity, and a kiss behind the barricades.